So welcome, everyone. First of all, I'm Guillaume Touchette. So I'm the SC with Extreme Networks for Canada East. So that includes Quebec and the Maritimes. So thanks for joining us today for another one of those Tech Talk sessions. We will try to keep this session around 45 minutes length. We won't go up to the hours, and that's intended to give you guys some time. We'll try to trickle the Q&A through the session as well when we do the config later on. So about the Q&A, well, please post your question in that panel instead of the chat because it will be more monitored. I have some colleagues here to help me maybe answer questions before we're at the end of the sessions. And don't forget to mention the topic when you ask a question because sometimes we will only respond to them later. So we need to know what you were asking about. As well in the Q&A, we welcome things like topic suggestions as well and things like that if you have any kind of other subjects you want to see talked about in further sessions. As well, this session is recorded and it will be most likely available on Extreme Networks YouTube playlist or YouTube channel, as well as the past ones that are already there. So when we do the demo and everything, sometimes there is CLI comments that I will use. You won't see them for a long time, but that's a bit intended not to make this session so long. You can go back on YouTube afterwards and have a look if you want to take notes. So this is the agenda we will follow today. We'll first start by detailing on which hardware you might come across this OS, the Switch Engine OS, the subject of today. So you can more easily see where it fits within the enterprise network. And then we'll spend a few minutes showing you when it's a good fit to choose this OS for your universal switches. So what kind of advantages does it have compared to others of our solutions, what it can do. Then we'll have a quick discussion on the different ways this platform can be managed. And after which, we'll finally jump into a demo switch and start provisioning a device, a stack. So for today, we'll only have time to do a basic configuration. So we will start with a brand new stack, enable stacking on it, and do a software upgrade on it. And in further sessions that will most likely happen in a month or two, we will go a bit more hands-on on those switches with more advanced config examples. So let's start with a quick review of what the present and past switch models can run this OS that we're talking about today. So this is a global view of Extreme's switching portfolio. So we have solutions to cover the whole enterprise networking needs, all the way from branch to data center, even border routing. But the Switch Engine OS, this is mainly found on our campus solutions and a few branch-specific models. So in the past, all of the X series switches were using what we call the EXOS, so EXOS operating system. A few of them are still available, but most now have an equivalent in the universal switches portfolio. So they're being slowly phased out. For universal switches, then users have the choice between two operating systems, Fabric Engine or Switch Engine. And Switch Engine, this is a direct evolution of the EXOS EXOS OS. So a lot of the info you might find about EXOS still applies to Switch Engine. So that's why I'm often using both terms to describe this OS, because a lot of the information you can find about it on our website and the internet still references EXOS, the older name of this operating system. So what you will most likely deploy today, though, are switches from the Universal series, where you have a choice between a stacking-centric or a more fabric-centric OS. And it can all be managed natively by our cloud platform or by our on-site management solution. They all run the same version of Switch Engine with the same feature set, except for very few advanced features that are hardware dependent. But apart from that, there's really only the scaling limits that are different between the models. So we have models ranging from the entry tier 5320s with fixed power supply and 40 gig stacking, for example. And the most popular ones that we'll see today are the mid-tier 5420s and 5520 series, where then we have a wide variety of different hardware combination in those series with faster stacking, modular power supplies, and some multi-rate models, some PoE++ models as well, and even a few that make great distribution switches with 24 SFP+ ports, for example. And the 57 series, this is mostly aimed at top of rack or high bandwidth application with 10 gig base T models and PoE++ across the board. And recently, we've also introduced our new universal core switches, which are the 7520s and 7720s. So these will give you high capacity option for enterprise cores or very dense aggregation with up to 48 times 25 gigs, so SFP28 ports, or a full 100 gig model. And these newer options, well, they've been purchasable for a few months now, but they will begin shipping to customer around this summer. So what is common to all of those models, all of our universal switches portfolio? So all the way from the 5420 to the 7720. So we already mentioned the OS choice, switch engine or fabric engine, but it can also all be onboarded by Extreme Cloud IQ for zero-touch provisioning, either cloud natively or using our on-site platform. They all share a common Premier and MaxSec OS licenses, which we'll talk about later. And these are valid for both OS choices. Management is also purchased using a single SKU for every one of those models. That's the pilot license. And finally, they also all share a similar lifetime warranty policy on the hardware, as well as onboarding GTech access for all of them. All right. So when should you choose switch engine for your enterprise network? When is it the best choice between our different campus solutions? So what can it do for you? Which situation is it the best choice? So before we get into a few more specific scenarios, it's important to note that there's a very wide range of standards and protocols it supports. So that's why it's often a great choice in a multi-vendor environment where you need to integrate, for example, a switch engine access layer or edge layer to a different manufacturer's distribution or core setup, for example. It has basically everything you need to seamlessly integrate into most popular networking infrastructures we see today from every vendor. So we're talking, classic layer 3 networks using spanning tree and OSPF or BGP routing with full VRF support, or networks that use standard multicast routing protocols like PIM-SM and MSDP or other PIM sauces, or even more modern fabric solution. Switch engine supports BGP EVPN and VXLAN as an overlay, and it can even act as a VXLAN VTEP. And it also offers great option for high port density closets with Extreme's extended edge. So this is a solution where we have a port extension models that are driven by a switch engine device and just provide additional gigabit and PoE plus ports with full feature set for a very cost-effective solution for high port density. And all of this, well, that's also why this is a great choice for those of you with a park of existing ERS switches. Those switches will need to be updated in the next few years. And if you are not yet ready to go full fabric to the edge with Fabric Connect, then Switch Engine provides a great stacking alternative that can maintain your current network topology. So to be honest, there's practically nothing that could be done with an ERS switch that cannot be done using Switch Engine. That includes stacking up to 8 units. That includes everything about fabric attach and zero-touch onboarding. It also removes a few of the limitations that you're probably used to by now if you are an existing ERS customer, like the stacking distance, for example. With Switch Engine, you can use SharePort for stacking if you want, and so you can run your stacks using standard cabling, and you're not limited to same room or same cabinet stacking like you used to. And another factor to consider is that, well, if you're considering eventually to go with a complete Fabric Connect to the edge network and solution, but you're just not ready, then with a Switch Engine Access Edge, you already have everything you need to go Fabric. You just need to change the OS and the switches when you're ready and to run Fabric Engine. So speaking of Fabric Connect or SPDM, the name of the protocol, as a lot of people call it, Switch Engine stacks, they're also designed to be used as the edge of your Fabric network. So this is not exclusive, Switch Engine or Fabric Engine. They all have the required features to act as a Fabric attached proxy, a standalone proxy, or a Fabric attached client. So this means that if they are uplinked to a Fabric Engine or a VOS switch, you can extend all of the automated provisioning features of your Fabric services or your ISIDs to your Switch Engine edge. That eliminates the need to manually create and configure user VLAN anywhere on your edge switch. Another little aspect that sets Switch Engine apart is its policy engine. Now, especially when working in tandem with an Extreme Control network access control solution, a NAC solution, it can provide a great centralized dynamic filtering engine, where you only need to configure your user roles centrally in Extreme Control, and then they are pushed and applied dynamically on all your edge switches using the user authentication request. So those role-based policies are a much better way to handle ACLs at the edge, as it makes them uniform across all of your network, which is one of the harder things to keep going if you do manual ACLs. And they're all updated dynamically alongside with user authentication. Now we'll briefly talk about the very more specific scenario, a more specific use case for Switch Engine, but it's an important one for some of our customers. Switch Engine supports a suite of audiovisual oriented protocols that are often needed for live display and signage applications. Customers who need these protocols, like PTP, for example, Precision Time Protocol, they really don't have a lot of choice for the networking hardware. And that's something we can provide. So with older exhaust switches, the X series, you needed a special license to use these features, but they're now included in the base software for every universal switch. Now, the only limitation when you're running the AVB protocols is that the switches cannot be stacked. But this is rarely a concern in those cases, as those are usually deployed as a separate mission-specific installation for those switches. But this basically enables our customers who have this requirement on site to run all of their audiovisual network using the same hardware and the same OS as the rest of their normal network. And they don't have to deal with yet another vendor of specialized equipment in their park. And finally, let's touch again quickly on the Premier and the MACsec licenses. So this applies to all of the universal switches. There is a separate optional license, a lifetime license, that enables features that are meant more for core and aggregation equipment. In the case of Switch Engine, that enables, for example, full-scale OSPF, BGP, ISIS, and multicast. What this means by full-scale is that without the license, those protocols, they're still available, and they're still full-featured, but just for a limited number of neighbors in the case of the routing protocols. But that number is usually enough for most of the access and edge switches use cases. It's either 2 or 4, depending on the protocols. But if you need more to use them as aggregation or as a core layer, this is when you would need the Premier license. And that license is also needed, though, to enable GRE tunneling and EVPN as a whole. Now, these licenses, they're transferable both from an equipment to another, and also from Switch Engine to Fabric Engine. This is the same license. The only difference is that the feature set that's enabled by the Premier is a bit different on Fabric Engine because the feature set of the OS is different. And concerning MACsec, well, it also comes as a separate license for the universal hardwares with ports that support MACsec. This is mostly as a way to be compliant with export regulations, but it's important to know if it's a need on your network. So now, before we connect to a device, let's just see quickly the different management options that are available to you for Switch Engine switches. So directly onboard the switches without needing additional software. Well, of course, you have access to a full CLI using console port SSH telnet. But from that CLI, a great feature of Switch Engine is that you can run scripts directly from the switch. So there can be RC scripts that run on boot, or there can be runtime scripts that are written either in TCL or in Python that can be run directly on the switch. There are also a few configuration wizards that are available directly from the CLI from some more specific protocols. And on top of that, there are additional scripts that are already available on Extreme Networks' GitHub page, which were made either by users, customers, or by Extreme employees. So you should look that up before you start writing something from scratch. And for customers looking into standard-based automation, it's important to note we provide a RESTconf API on all Switch Engine models. So info about the different Yang modules that are available for configuration, it's all available directly on the switch if you have one at hand using the URL mentioned here. And finally, there's also an onboard web interface that's called Chalet, which provides some overall visibility on a specific switch or stack, as well as some configuration for the interfaces for everyday tasks and a few configuration wizards for specific protocols. Now, if we move a bit outward to the cloud, all Switch Engine stacks and switches can be managed natively by Extreme Cloud IQ. So they can be deployed with zero-touch provisioning and they will automatically receive the firmware revision, full configuration. Switch deployment in the field can basically all be done by non-networking staff or even non-technical staff using our mobile application to onboard devices, for example. And then all of their configuration can be managed natively from our secure and optionally Canadian hosted cloud platform. So that includes switch templates, port templates, authentication, security. And then this is all actively monitored with visibility into the user's devices, but also the traffic going on your equipment, as well as some alerting and event monitoring. So all of this full switch management features, it's all available using the Pilot license. Now, though, we also offer an additional level of visibility into your network. So with the CoPilot add-on license, then you get access to AI and ML-driven anomalies and behavior detection mechanisms to identify some network problems that can occur before they start affecting user, with explanations and recommendations and actions to take. Support tickets can also be automatically generated from those detected problems. And CoPilot also includes access to digital twins. So these are cloud-run instances of your switch engine or fabric engine switches on which you can test config changes, you can test migrations or updates and upgrades before you deploy them on a live network. And finally, we also offer a full management and analytics on-prem solution with Extreme Cloud IQ Site Engine. So this uses the same Pilot license. So you may choose which management solution is the best fit for your environment at any time. Site Engine provides you a full zero-touch provisioned experience as well, full switch management, and it also includes Layer 7 application visibility to your whole network using SFlow, IPFix, and what we call app telemetry, which is available on all switch engine devices. And this is also where you can find Extreme Control, or NAC solution that enables the centralized role-based policy engine to deploy on your switch engine network. All right, so this is it for the talk. Now we will go into a live equipment, and I'll show you a few things to get going a new switch engine switch. So give me a second to you. All right, here we are. So before we go into stacking the switches, we'll show you how to get into a new switch. First of all, the default login is admin with no password. So start it here. Brings us into our switch. Now let's see a few comments to see what software revision we're currently running and whether we need to do an update on this switch. You can see them using show switch command, where we can see in this part here that we are currently running on the secondary partition with the two different versions available. There are two partitions on every switch engine switch, so two different software revision that can stay on memory that you can swap from one to the other. If you want more details about the version we are currently running, we can use the command show version. Now, about switch update, let's go back to the presentation. There are basically three different methods that we can use to push a new software revision onto our switch engine switches. There is, first of all, SCP, which we will use in the demo, so I'll skip this one for now. There's also TFTP, good old protocol, but not secure, that we can use, where we only need to specify the IP of the server and the file name. As an example here, I've selected in the same command line on which partition I want to install the software we're downloading, which you don't need at any point to mention, because if you don't mention it, it will only use the alternate partition. And then we instruct it to install it at this time and to reboot the device. So this one command for TFTP would effectively download the file, install it on the primary partition, and reboot the device without anything else to do. And you can also use a USB flash drive to transfer the file to the device if it's not accessible through networking means. So the first two commands are more to what we need to do to see if there's a USB device present and what the files are on the current device that's inserted. And then the other command is to download one of the files to the local flash. So if we go back in our device, in our case, we will use SCP. If I put the command here without entering it. So on that command, I've put a bit more arguments just to show you. You can, for example, specify in which VR or SCP server is residing. Then we set our username for the server because SCP, there is authentication. Then the IP of the server, the file name on the server, and the file name that we want to save locally. So if we hit that, oh yeah, I need to do that. Now I don't have network access to my server, which is running on my laptop. So we will create, we won't go into details today, but we will quickly create an IP address on the switch that we can use to reach it for this case. Let me enter some comments and I'll explain them. All right, so here's what we did. We created a VLAN called management 10. Then we configured that VLAN to use the tag 10, which is basically the VLAN number 10 associated to it. And then we configure an IP address on that VLAN, which will be 10.0.0.2 for this lab. And finally, we assign this VLAN to the port 24, which is the port in which my PC is already connected in with a fixed address. Now that this is done, let's try again our SCP transfer. Now it's asking me for my password for the SCP authentication. And this will take about 20 seconds. So now, by the way, is a good time to start putting your questions in the Q&A if there aren't any. Oh, no, I'm not seeing them yet, but in about 30 seconds, we'll have a switch reboot and we can take a minute or two to answer some of those questions. So now the download has been done and it just needs to write the file on the switch flash. All right, and now that this is done, in this case, I've done it in 2 different comments. So now with this command, we will install the image with the file name that we just downloaded and reboot it. So you notice I don't set the partition here, just so it will use the alternate partition to whichever one is currently used. Now was the secondary, so it will just install it on the primary and reboot the switch. We'll get that going, just asking us if we want to save the current config or not. And it will do. Now this will last about 2 minutes, so if you have anything to share with us, now is a good time. Well, I see there is already a few questions that were already answered, but I'll still tell them to everyone in case you haven't seen them. So we have someone asking, do we need licenses to use routing protocols? Well, I've probably answered them later on in the presentation, but basically all of the basic layer 3 functionality is included out of the box. So this means, let's reiterate on that all the normal routing protocols, the OSPF, BGP, PIM, and all of that, they can be used full featured out of the box, but with a maximum number of neighbors. Which, top of my head, I think it's 2 neighbors for BGP and 4 for OSPF. If you want to go above this number of neighbors on a switch, this is when you need the premier license. The exception to that is for more advanced protocol like GR retunneling and EVPN. For those, you need the premier license to enable the protocol. So yeah, I think that answers the questions that we had so far. If there's none other, then we can already start talking about the stacking process while the system reboots. So out of the box, the switch engine switch does not have stacking enabled. Everything is there for that. It will detect other switches that are connected through the stacking cable, but the stacking itself is not enabled. For that, well, there's another question, but there's another reboot, so we'll answer you in a minute. So when we want to enable stacking on the switch engine switch, first of all, we always connect the cables before we enter whatever commands and method I'm about to describe. So we start by connecting the cables. And then after that, we can enable stacking from 3 different methods. So either through CLI, through the console, which we will do in this lab. So I'll skip this one again, and I'll come back to it in a minute. But we can also enable stacking through the mode button, which is just a little push button that's in the front of every universal switches. So the prerequisite to enable stacking with the mode button and the USB flash drive as well is that all the switches need to be on default configuration, right out of the box. And then all you need to do is that on the switch which you want to be the master of the stack, then you would press the mode button twice until the stack LED lights up, and then you keep the button pressed for 5 seconds. Then the switch, or more the stack, will go into a configuration process that can take a minute or two. Can appear like nothing is happening, but they are doing their things. So wait it out a bit for a few minutes, and then after a while, the whole stack will reboot. And when it comes back, the stack will be enabled in stacking mode. The process is very similar if you want to enable it using a USB flash drive, which we can do. So the switch also needs to be with the default configuration. And on the primary switch, on the master switch, you would then insert a USB flash drive with a file name with the name that you can see here in the presentation, an empty file. And it will send the switches into the same configuration process as you would do with the mode button to enable stacking. So those 2 last methods are really useful for remote deployments where there's not necessarily networking or even technical staff available to help you get started. So you can have anyone do those 2 exercises to get a stack going, after which it will follow its normal zero-touch provisioning deployment process, depending on the management platform you're using. Now, if we do it through the console, now let's see. Stay here and let's see if we are back. Okay, there we go. So just before I log back in, we can see that for about 30 seconds, this login prompt was displayed when the switch came back. What this means is that during that time, the switch configuration is not yet loaded. It will not use your normal logging information to log it. If I enter admin and no password at this point, I wouldn't have gotten through. The only login that will work is what we call the FailSafe password. There is a FailSafe account more on those switches, which is outside of the configuration files, so it does not get affected by it, and it cannot be deleted like all the normal user accounts. So it's basically a last resort login account that you can use. And so some people, you know, if they restart the stack and they do not know about this different feature, they might start troubleshooting a user login issue that it's not existent. Sometimes you just need to wait about 20 to 30 seconds until the full configuration is loaded. And we have our normal login screen, which will be for whatever the configuration file allows, radius logging, TACAX logging, or just local logging that we're doing now. Let's do a show switch again, where we can see that we're now using the primary partition, which is running 32.3 software, so up from 32.2. So now we can go into stacking. So once again, if we stack using the CLI, we need to pre-connect the stacking cables between the 2 switches. This is already done in my lab. On some models, and not on the one I'm using here, so I'm mentioning it before, you have first to enter the command enable stacking support. This is for the models on which the stacking ports can also be used as normal networking ports, which is their default mode. This will be the case for most of the universal switches. But on switch like this one, we only need enable stacking on the master switch to get it going. Before then, let's do a show stacking to see the current state. So as we can see, it knows that there is another switch currently connected using the stacking cables. It sees it, but you can see the stack state is disabled by default. So all we need to do is enable the stacking mode. So this switch is recognized and it's put in a stack with this one. Little note here, which does not apply to the other methods, but if you do it this way through CLI, you have to make sure before you enter it that both switches, or up to 8 switches, they all run on the same partition with the same OS version. If you use the other 2 methods to enable your stack, the master will update or upgrade the other switches if needed, but not if you're using the CLI method. So let's enter enable stacking. where we want. And now at this point, if there's anything that it deems where the switches are not ready to be stacked. So for example, just like I told you, if it needs a firmware update, if it's not running on the good partition, you will see it here as a warning or as an error. In our case, I've cheated a bit. The switches are ready. I knew the second switches is already running on the primary partition with 32.3 as well. So it only gives me a warning that the config is not safe, but that's it. So we will proceed. And now the stack will get config and both switches will reboot again. We'll give that a minute. So there is another minute or two if you have more questions for us. Let's open the Q&A panel. Okay, so we have a question that's it's a bit more open-ended. And so the switch can be used as a WAN router. Well, of course, that depends on what protocols you need for your WAN links. But it will run BGP v4 with a full feature set. The lower universal switches, of course, they cannot do internet border routing. They don't have the table size for it, but they can definitely do BGP for connection to an ISP and redundant connection to ISPs. If they gave you your AS numbers, for example, we've used that multiple customers. They can also do the GRE tunneling option, which can help for WAN connections. What else? If we have other WAN relevant information my co-panelists can think about, feel free to jump in. And while we're doing that, we can see our switch is, like I said, with our pre-login, where right now I could only log in using the FailSafe account. So if I enter admin, I'll get denied. Right. We are reaching the end of our presentation for today. There's only a few more things I'll show you once we get login access again. All right, we are available. So let's log back in. And now, well, first of all, we see the prompt has changed, but if we do again show stacking, we can see that now our stacked state is active for both of them. And it has selected the master, the which on one I'm currently connected to, right? That's why there is this asterisk here, is to mean this is the switch I'm currently controlling with my console cable. And just to show as well that we're in a stacks, we can do a show ports command, where we can see a live display of the port status. I don't know if you can see the cursor moving in the web presentation, but basically this screen is updating every second or two. So the info that we see now is pretty much live. And if we do down to change pages, we can see port 24 is the one we use for connection. But after that, we can see that switch 2 is now on board with its 48 ports, plus the stacking and the uplinks. So now we know our stack is functional and ready for further config, which is probably what we'll do in the next session on this subject. So right before I leave you, I'll show you one last very useful command for Switch Engine, which is how to reset everything to default. So let's do that with unconfigure switch all. And if I don't specify which switch, that means the whole stack. So once I hit enter and I confirm, then both of those switches will reboot, and they will reboot on default configurations, which mean with stacking disabled and in pretty much the state they were in when we first connected to today. Right. So this is it for our presentation today. We're well within the time that we allotted. So if you have any other question, we'll be around for another minute or two. And if not, then I want to wish you guys a nice day, and thanks a lot for joining us today. And in about a week, you should see this session on our YouTube channel. If you're looking back at the info, if you forgot a comment, if you want to see something, it will be available publicly. And if not, then we'll keep updating you guys whenever we do other sessions. Thank you.